Today I'm going to start with the argument that I want to make. And it is something that Ben Shapiro said, but it's been said by many great individuals. And it's simply that material man is a greater threat than religious man. What that means is that when an individual or a society embraces atheism and materialism, in other words, there's nothing supernatural. The natural world is all there is. We don't have somewhere we're going after we die. There's not a God overseeing this world. that way of thinking, that way of believing, that way of acting in the world is actually more dangerous than religious man. And the reason this is so important is because one of the arguments that's often made about why religion is such a bad idea and the damage that it does is the Crusades. And although the Crusades weren't great, and that's a discussion for another day, that is one instance of a perceived religious cause acting out in a way that does a lot of harm. But it's not the common story. It's not the rule, it's the exception. And in a broader context, if you look at the history of the West, what you see is that when people are constrained by religious thought and belief, they are overall to themselves, to their families, to their communities, and to the world less dangerous than when people don't believe that there's accountability and personal responsibility and an objective reality that they can't change and a higher law they have to submit to and eternal justice. When people don't believe those things, there's this incredible breakdown. A lot of people, Richard Dawkins is probably the most famous, hold atheism up as a standard. He pairs it with humanism, and he says, so if we're humanistic enough, if we just love humanity enough, then it won't break down into what we see in the 20th century with ideologies such as communism. And statistically, we know in the 20th century, you've got America and many countries in the West, especially America, as still a predominantly religious place, religious state or nation. And then you see these nations, Russia, China, Italy, other nations in North Korea. You even see, even with Hitler's, his was a different, maybe a different flavor of totalitarianism, but definitely that communistic bent, that government owns it all. What you see when this radical atheism is embraced, and when these ideologies come in play in these nations, where there's this idea that we've got to save ourselves. God's not going to save us. We have to create utopia ourselves. And the way to do that is for a certain group of elite people to run a government that owns everything and to tell everybody what to do and to force them into line if they don't. And those underlying ideas were prevalent in all of these nations, and they chased God out as quickly as they could. And what you see is that while the world wars, people just fighting each other over whatever, killed, and I didn't go back and check the exact number, it's around somewhere between 40 and 50 million. In that same time frame, in that same 20th century, over 100 million people were killed by their own governments in materialistic, atheistic, ideological nations. This atheistic ideology or worldview or religion. And so the argument that Ben Shapiro is making, that Andrew Klavi is making, that Fyodor Dostoevsky is making, that Leo Tolstoy is making, that so many other of these great thinkers are making is very simple. like I began with, that materialist man is more of a threat. Mankind, humankind, focused on just the here and now, focused on needing to save ourselves, focused on trying to chase out God and live for today, even with a humanist bent, is far more dangerous than religious humanity that believes in laws higher than themselves and a God they have to be accountable to and lots of personal responsibility, a conscience, all those good things. So I'm going to tell you a couple stories that kind of exemplifies where this can lead. And it's going to feel extreme, but it's important to know that this kind of radical thinking is becoming more and more prevalent. I'll wrap that up with an Andrew Klavan quote, some thoughts at the end. But I want to tell you about the Marquis de Sade and Fyodor Dostoevsky's response to him, because it kind of demonstrates these two extremes. So we get the word sadism, sadism, as a sexual and perversion, as a term, even as a psychological illness, from the Marquis de Sade. He lived 1740 to 1814, and you can look him up. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Basically, both of his parents kind of abandoned him when he was young. They had some level of wealth, and so he was basically raised by servants who had to just basically do whatever he wanted. And so he became the most narcissistic human you can imagine, who believed that the world revolved around him and that he could get away with whatever he wanted to get away with, and he spent his life living that out. Now, does materialistic worldview, the Marxist, socialist way of thinking, does that have to break down into this kind of extreme narcissism? I don't know. But we're seeing more and more of it the longer we go down that road. So he was indulged. He was very temperamental and spoiled. He became a very sexually perverted individual early on, and was imprisoned, I think, half his life or maybe over half of his life for a myriad of behaviors, really grotesque, sadistic behaviors. He coined the phrase for what those were. And when he was imprisoned is when he wrote his books with very graphic pornographic images, and they continue to be read. People continue to defer to them. Some famous philosophers read his works, even like some things about him, even defend him at times. There was one particular postmodernist, as I was researching, that came up in particular that defended the Marquis de Sade, and others around him. So it's not as if he's disappeared. He's still read, and I want to read you this little excerpt that condenses the way that de Sade was thinking, that helps us understand, because it isn't always the best idea to say, okay, what if this thing I'm doing right now, what if everybody did it? That doesn't always work. But a lot of the time it does work as a way of evaluating the value, the constructiveness of your behavior. And so when you take the way de Sade was living and you ask yourself, okay, so what's that stemming from? It's stemming from an aggressive anger against the Judeo-Christian ethic and religion. We saw that Kinsey had the same aggressive reaction. He was vocally anti-God, anti-religion, and he's not the only one. There's other people that we could name, definitely Marx and others. And so when you begin there and you say, I'm throwing that all out, and you say God is dead, like Nietzsche did, and then you say we need to make our own value system. If you take that logic to its end, you basically get Desaad. And, or say, I might even be saying it wrong. People might correct the way I'm saying it, but that's the best way I know how to say his name. Anyway, and I'm going to read you his philosophy drawn from his writings and his way of thinking about himself and the world. And to be honest, there's really no way, there's no reason that when you discard God and any kind of moral framework that's inherent in the world and in our being as humans, as humanity, when you discard that, there's no reason not to go down this road and to embrace this philosophy. And it's the reason why in communist countries it could get so radical and so out of control, because why not? Human beings don't matter. Any specific individual has to be sacrificed to the state, to the greater good. And what is that greater good? That greater good is that we're going to somehow save ourselves and build utopia, and the means always justifies the ends. And so you wind up killing 6 million Jews. You wind up starving your people to death. And so this is kind of a summary of the philosophy of Desaad. Saad's philosophy flowed from his radical egotism, which led him to propound militant anti-theism. So very anti-theist. So here it goes. God's non-existence reduces the universe to a purely materialist nature, a self-running mechanism, quote, the perpetual motion of matter explains everything. So materialist man. There's only material. There's only the here and now. There's only this life. We come and go in the blink of an eye. We're just the result of accidental, chaotic processes. That means that people are deterministic machines, which annuls, gets rid of, moral responsibility. You can't help it then if you're sexually perverse or depraved. And to be honest, you start getting rid of those labels. Why would you call it sexually depraved? Well, because somebody's doing something that you don't like because it has a moral framework around it. If everything is just material and anything goes, then anything just goes, which is where he takes it to. So if we're just machines and we're accidents, we don't have any moral responsibility. So if you can't help it, this is what you like, if you're pursuing your own passions and gratifying yourself, you can't help it. You're just an accident. I mean, even Hawking said this. If we could do the math, we could prove that humans don't really have free will. That's Hawking's argument. Stephen Hawking. So this runs in line with an anti-God, anti-religious perspective. So then there is no afterlife, so your conduct does not matter. There's no accountability. So you're merely the child of local custom, and morality is relative to culture and geography, and therefore it's fictive. So again, all Saad is doing is taking these anti-God, anti-religious, materialistic arguments to their logical end. There's no moral responsibility, there's no ultimate accountability, and any kind of morality that people claim is just based on their culture, and it's just a fiction. It doesn't matter. So, nature is our only ethical guide. Humans are no more significant to nature than insects, and since nature uses matter from dead life forms to create new ones, crime, destruction, and death are necessary and pleasing to her. Therefore, murder is good, and the mass murder is the highest human type. Now, one thing I didn't know until I was getting into this is that Crime and Punishment, which I actually just read last year for the first time, I'd been wanting to read it, started it, finally got through it, was a direct response to Saad's Justine, his novel Justine. And I found this really fascinating article that went through point by point where Dostoevsky is kind of using the same conclusions that Saad draws from an an anti-religious, anti-God perspective and saying, you're right that that's where that kind of thinking takes you, but let's look how it plays out in real life for the average human in the real world. And that was really fascinating because Crime and Punishment was awesome, and to see it in that way was also really helpful. So we have the Enlightenment. It says, let's use reason. That starts to erode a belief in God. Eventually, Darwin comes along, and this is Ben Shapiro talking about Darwinism. Darwinism was seen by the intelligentsia of the time as a final permission to break with the ways of the ancients, i.e., the natural moral law and God. Finally, at long last, the superstitions of religion could be put aside. Finally, at long last, the legacy of the ancient Greeks could be escaped. Mankind, in joining the animals, had finally liberated himself from the chains of the divine. So along in the midst of all of this, in the mid-19th century, Fyodor Dostoevsky shows up. And he's reading all these things. He's watching this. He's very acquainted with de Sade. At first, he's like, maybe there's something to what he's saying. Maybe he has a point here. And then as time goes on, the more he understands it and the more depth he gains in his thinking and writing and understanding, the more he goes to battle with that. And at the same time, of course, this Darwinian perspective, he's seeing the erosion of faith. He's seeing that these intellectual ideas are also at play. And he's concerned about the final result of that. He's concerned, and he rightly concludes that if we follow that frame of thinking, if we go that direction, if we throw God and religion out and try to remake our own morality, we will wind up with the Sadist worldview. Fyodor Dostoevsky saw that the Sadean perspective is the logical endpoint of a system without God, theorizing that without morality, all constraints on human behavior would disappear. That is exactly right. He foresaw, think communism and world dictators, that materialist man was far more a threat than religious man. And so it goes on to talk about how it says, Dostoevsky scholar Robert Louis Jackson has shown references to Sade occur frequently in both Dostoevsky's notebooks and his novel. The insulted and injured, the possessed, the brothers Karamazov. In fact, Dostoevsky did far more. Where the romantics and decadents self-indulgently embraced Sade as a liberator, Dostoevsky confronted and repudiated him and reaffirmed the Christian worldview that Sade so ferociously rejected. And so then it starts going through his works. Evidence in Crime and Punishment and The Brother Karamazov makes clear that Dostoevsky had read Sade's novels closely and pondered them. He drew on specific incidents in them and addressed specific arguments. He shared Sade's insight that egoism repudiates God and propounds nihilism in order to attain liberation for sexual license, crime, destruction, and murder. So he says, yes, Sade was right, that this is where that line of thinking is going to take you. Eventually, it's going to be licensed to do anything. But where Sade gleefully preached this, Dostoevsky condemned it. His work reveals a steadily deepening critical engagement with Sade, culminating in The Brothers Karamazov, which, if you haven't read it, one of my top 10, such an incredible book. I reread it every few years. So phenomenal. And he, through his characters and through the storyline, goes to battle with this central argument: can we do without God or not? Can we do without the Judeo-Christian ethic? What's going to happen to mankind if we throw that away? And he was right in his predictions. So, of course, the siren song today is, why should we restrain? We aren't hurting anyone. And what we're finding in our society are that we're growing sicker and sicker, and we're growing more and more what would be traditionally called wicked, evil, sinful. We've got our fetishists and our sex workers and sex trafficking is on the rise and suicide is continually on the rise. I heard a statistic the other day that it's going up, suicidality and deaths by despair, whether that's alcoholism, overdose. Those are now the leading cause of death in, I can't remember if it was the West or in America. I think it's in America. We are more depressed. We are more anxious. I mean, if we look at the chronic societal results of this movement away from God to make our own way, to be liberated from God and his laws, it's not working well. Ben Shapiro said, Dostoevsky predicted that the search for meaning we all need, freed from the connection to the Judeo-Christian values and the Greek natural laws, quote, would burst forth in a conflagration that will set the whole world on fire. God's death, Dostoevsky thought, was man's death as well. And the reason for that is that it's only in these higher ideals, the elevation of mankind to a child of God, and the need to improve ourselves constantly in preparation for the future and future lives, and the constraints on our nature that cause us to discipline ourselves to our higher nature, that builds meaning into the framework of existence, taking on personal responsibility, striving to be our best, striving for the Christian Christ ideal is what gives mankind purpose. So, to Andrew Klavan, and this really, I think, encapsulates the essence of what's going on in our world today. He said, wokeness is a very deep philosophical movement. It is the bottom of atheistic philosophy. It is impossible to make a good story out of it because it has no inner life. The whole premise of wokeness is that we have no spiritual life. Everything is power. Therefore, you can't say anything about what it is to be a human. And so today, like I said, we see this increase in these behaviors that were considered just a few decades ago completely decadent and the deterioration of the human spirit is becoming manifest in what we see in our culture. We see the fruits. Jesus said, by their fruits you shall know them. And if this new worldview of we're going to make up our own values, we're going to leave God and religion behind, these are the fruits, and those numbers climb every year, then it should tell us something really, really important about this path we've been on for the last 150 years, since we really embraced Darwinism and we really embraced Marx. What's happening in the entire world, the number of deaths, the number of tragedies, the number of people who have lost their freedom versus gaining their freedom based on the American model. We're sicker and sicker. Our families are less and less intact. We're more addicted. We have less meaning. We're more alone. Reports of loneliness, reports of meaninglessness. The list goes on and on about how just unhappy we are. And so my question to all of us is, how long are we going to allow ourselves to go down this road, claiming that we're free by leaving true freedom behind? The scripture said, where the freedom of God, where the Spirit of God is, there is liberty. It's so true. True liberty, true freedom is a result of discipline. We see that in sports. We see that in relationships, that the more disciplined we are in our behavior, the more we live according to the true laws and principles that govern that area of life, the more freedom we have to express ourselves, to be great on the field, to have an enriching, fulfilling relationship. And the more we leave behind those absolutes, the more we lose our freedom. We think that we're freer because we can do whatever we want and we're not hurting anyone, but we're slaves to our passions. And we're depressed, and we're sad, and we're lonely, and we're suicidal. So let's remember that where there is discipline, there is the greatest amount of freedom. And discipline comes from aligning yourself with God's natural moral law and his principles. We can know those through the exercise of our conscience and through educating our divine conscience to elevate above the social conscience around us so that we can do what we know to be right, regardless of what the people around us are saying. And we can speak the truth instead of just speaking my truth and your truth. And we can know what reality is and live inside it so that we can flourish. If you want to know more about some of the things I've introduced today and talked about with the natural moral law, head over to audreyrindlisbacher.com and opt in for my free video training, Natural Law, the Framework of Successful Living. And I'll see you next time.